She just got to the heart of it. We'll resume our hearings this afternoon, and I'd like to welcome our next participant, Gerard Brody from the Consumer Action Law Centre, joining us. Thank you, Gerard, for attending this afternoon. And just for the purpose of the transcript, if you wouldn't mind stating your name and organisation, and then if you'd like to make some brief opening remarks, and then we can have a chat.
Great. So my name is Gerard Brody. I'm appearing on behalf of the Consumers Federation of Australia. In fact, my day job is the CEO of the Consumer Action Law Centre, but the Consumers Federation is a peak body for consumer organisations in Australia, representing a diverse range of consumer organisations, including most national consumer organisations. Just to clarify, Consumer Action, we don't do a lot of work in superannuation due to our resources and capacity, and that impacts some of the comments I'll make today, which are really about the benefits of investment in consumer advocacy, including with respect to superannuation. So Consumers Federation is an unfunded peak body that runs on a very small budget made up of membership income. CFA has 2 part-time staff members and very limited capacity to support its members, being national and state-based consumer organisations, to provide input to policy development processes. The Productivity Commission, in its 2008 inquiry into consumer policy, noted that confident and empowered consumers secure better outcomes for themselves and for society as a whole when there is effective consumer input into policy making. The Commission said that consumer input should lead to better policies and generate greater support for those policies. Noting that it is difficult for individual consumers to represent themselves, the Commission also said there was a case for increased public resourcing for consumer research, analysis and advocacy. It noted, and I quote, "The benefits of participation in advocacy are often seen to fall well below the costs. This is largely due to the collective action problem. So where public policy and regulation should reflect a diffuse public interest, members of the community at large will, not unreasonably, question why they should devote a lot of time and energy when everyone else is free riding on those efforts. Ultimately, in that inquiry, the Commission accepted that there is a general case for governments to help ensure that consumer representatives have the financial wherewithal to make an effective input into policy, and it specifically recommended additional public funding to support the basic operating costs of a representative national peak body. Unfortunately, this was the only recommendation from that 2008 inquiry that was not acted upon by the federal government. Last year, in its research report into consumer law enforcement and administration, the Productivity Commission lamented that gaps remain in terms of consumer input into policy proposals, and it found that there are grounds to revisit that recommendation from the 2008 report. That is, the Commonwealth Government should provide additional public funding to support consumer research and advocacy. The federal government has not responded to that report from last year. The Productivity Commission has also previously found that specific sectors require specialist consumer advocacy. For example, in its 2011 inquiry into urban water reform, the Commission recognised the need for consumer advocacy and research in the area of water services. In its 2013 inquiry into electricity network regulatory arrangements, the Commission also supported the establishment of a national energy consumer advocacy body. Ultimately, such a body was established by the COEG Energy Council. Energy Consumers Australia today is an influential participant in energy policy debates and is also a full member of the Consumers Federation. This inquiry, of course, is about superannuation. While many of CFA's members conduct effective consumer advocacy and some do get involved in superannuation, it is fair to say there are limited contributions from consumer voices to superannuation policy and debates. I looked at the submissions to this inquiry, and out of over 100 submissions, only 2 were from organised consumer groups, neither of whom specialised in financial services or superannuation. Further, unlike sectors like telecommunications, health or energy, there is no public resources dedicated to consumer advocacy in financial services and superannuation. Consumer advocacy that is conducted in this sector is largely via community legal centres or through bodies like Choice. This might be contrasted with other countries like the UK, where there is a separately funded and established financial services consumer panel, which exists to be a consumer advocate and critical friend of the regulator in that country. There are other reasons that justify the need for consumer voice in super. First, it is compulsory. People are in it whether they have the skills to navigate it or not. This creates an obligation on government to ensure the system works in consumers' best interests. The law attempts to do this, but it's proven of itself to be insufficient. Giving consumers a voice in policy making is another powerful way of ensuring the system works in members' best interests. There is also an exceptionally large number of well-resourced industry bodies in superannuation, as I'm sure you will be aware, actually far more than other sectors. These bodies are actually resourced off the back of consumers' retirement income savings. And while they are well-meaning, they struggle to distinguish the interests of their members from those of consumers. There's previously been a proposal to support a specialist consumer advocacy body in Australia for superannuation, but it's yet to achieve reality. The concept of the Super Consumer Centre was first raised by Choice as a contribution to the Cooper Review. Then Minister for Financial Services, Bill Shorten, raised the possibility of it in a stronger super statement in September 2011 and announced a $10 million contribution from the federal government in October of that year. A business case was developed which recognised the role consumer advocacy and research could play in an industry that suffered from a lack of consumer trust. Drivers of trust included disappointing returns, conflicts of interest, cost versus perceived value, and policy volatility. The business case proposed 3 interventions: advocacy, assistance, and education. I'll just touch on each of those. So advocacy. This involves influencing government policy and industry practice, as well as targeted research and analysis, and providing a consumer perspective on emerging issues. This would help by ensuring more balanced and consumer-oriented outcomes on matters of importance to consumers. Second, assistance. This might involve triage and referral services for consumers who are experiencing problems with their super. This will not only help individuals navigate the complexity of the system, but it would enable the gathering and dissemination of intelligence of consumer risks and issues. This would in turn help regulators enforce and improve the rules applying to super. Third, education, provision of information sharing and awareness raising, and this might include social media and peer-to-peer education. Such activities may influence consumers to act in their own best interests in managing super and help them make better decisions. The 2013 proposal relied on an industry contribution in addition to government, which would provide for a corpus, the earnings of this which would fund the centre. The beauty of this model is that once the corpus was established, the centre would be free of conflicts of interest. I'm sure you'll agree that effective consumer advocacy requires independence from all parties, industry and governments, so that consumers have sovereignty. It is worth noting that the Super Consumer Centre has been established as a legal entity with a constitution and board. It has ASIC and ACNC registration. Thus, it provides a working model, if only it can now secure the funds to do its work. A well-resourced and effective Super Consumer Centre would aid the implementation of many of the Commission's positive recommendations for super. It would provide further analysis and research, as well as provide a strong voice in face of vested interests that too often hold back policy and law reform that further the consumer interests. I'm happy to take any questions.
Wow. Well, that was a great potted history of consumer interest in this space. And as you noted, we ourselves have had trouble sort of hearing the member perspective on these things. So I guess you could say we've got a sympathetic here in terms of trying to find better ways of contacting and getting members' views directly. I'd be interested in your views as a start on where you'd see the role of regulators. We've talked in our report about the regulators becoming member champions and taking more of a member focus rather than what might necessarily be in the interest of the funds. How do you see the role of regulators currently in the super space, and how would you see that interacting with this super centre if it was to be established?
Well, regulators obviously do and should act in the public interest, and that's in the interests of all stakeholders, but particularly the consumer interest. Regulators that are established to oversee particular markets. The market is designed to deliver on consumer interests, and the regulator plays a key role in ensuring that participants in that market are kept to account and there are good consumer outcomes. That said, a regulator necessarily has to balance different views and perspectives and interests when coming to do its work, and it necessarily does that. So I would see this a super consumer centre being an important adjunct to support the role of the regulator, providing the consumer perspective directly to it in its work, whether that's rulemaking, whether that's research, whether that's analysis that it undertakes, just as industry do today, and really providing that counterbalance. And perhaps even, as I said, acting as a critical friend to the regulator. That the UK Financial Services Consumer Panel, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, plays that role. It's actually a statutory established body with its own staff, and it really does research and releases policy statements. But most of its work, I understand, is sort of behind closed doors and in discussions with the regulator, influencing the regulator at a senior level to be more consumer focused.
And so would you see a similar kind of role here to that critical friend sort of model?
Yeah, I think that's an important role that a super consumer centre could play, but I also think it would be helpful to be a public advocate as well, to be out there speaking publicly in public debates for consumer interests in superannuation. And it can also, as I mentioned, play a role in educating consumers, and potentially assisting some consumers as well. I think when it comes to consumer organisations, there is value in having some direct assistance or casework type experience to inform your broader advocacy, so that you really understand what the issues and impacts are for consumers on particular issues.
And what sort of size did you see for the business case that was made at the time when it was made? What kind of budget was it looking at, and what kind of resources was it planned to have? And so, I guess if you could, we had some numbers that were helpful, and you may or may not have these from Choice in there. The evidence they gave us the other day about the number of effective full-time equivalents that the industry has doing this sort of work. How would the centre that you've proposed in the business case, what sort of resources would you have in relation to the industry if you got the sort of body you were hoping for?
Well, the proposal that was put forward some years ago, and the federal government then did contribute $10 million to the corpus. The idea was that industry was going to contribute, I believe, another $20 million. So it would be a $30 million corpus, of which the centre would rely on its earnings. Now, obviously, that depends on market rates and what earnings can be. But I think the idea that would return, say, $3 to $4 million a year, off which the centre could run. So under that guidance, you imagine it would have between 20, 25 staff across those various areas.
And the idea of the centre would be just focused on superannuation, presumably with the insurance attached at the moment. It would just be that the focus, or financial services more generally?
The proposal for Super Consumer Centre is to focus heavily on superannuation, particularly given it is a compulsory financial service for most people or workers. I think there's an important role to enhance the consumer advocacy. I also think there is a case generally for broader consumer support for consumer advocacy in financial services more broadly. But there are a number of consumer advocacy organisations working in that area already. There's less actually involved in superannuation.
And in terms of our report, and again, I'm not sure whether you only wanted to talk primarily about the centre today, but if you've had an opportunity to look at our report in any detail, do you feel that there's any areas that we've missed in relation to areas of consumer harm or detriment that we haven't addressed in our report?
I think your report is remarkably comprehensive, in fact, in a range of areas. I do think that that to get a lot of those ideas or proposals into reality is another thing. And so that's where I see the role of consumer advocacy playing an important role. We know that policy making and legislation making is a contested space, and we need to have an active voice championing for consumers to ensure that those recommendations actually become a reality.
And just in relation to consumer empowerment, I guess when we're thinking about the superannuation space, we're talking about members, and the work the Commission's done in looking at various models was to look at whether members themselves would be best placed to make the choices about where their super money would go, or whether employers should be involved, and what the role of other intermediaries might be. In terms of the default model and where we've landed in terms of our draft recommendations around employees making their own choice, or effectively consumers actively making their own choices in this area, is that something that you think is appropriate given the role you see of consumers in this industry?
As a consumer advocate, I support efforts to enhance consumer choice, but obviously that choice can be difficult when there's many, and it's hard for consumers or don't have the information or tools to make that choice. So, I was attracted to the proposal in your draft report about there being a best of show sort of list that helped sort of facilitated a choice. There was still a consumer part of that choice, but there was also some assistance in making that choice. And I think that recognises the real challenges and difficulties people face when making choices. The behavioural research tells us if you're faced with more than 7 choices, then you give up. And that tendency to default to no choice or just do what's easiest is really, really strong. So I think if that policy is accepted by government, there'll be a role to ongoing to monitor it and assess it. Is it working? Does it mean that people are making active choices? Is that leaving them better off? And they're sorts of the things that I think a super consumer centre could assist with.
Okay. Just on the governance model, I'm quite curious about the UK went for a statutory model. The model that you're proposing here would not be a statutory model, and I can see pros and cons of both.
Yeah.
I guess, given the role that you want it to have in terms of keeping the entire system honest from the perspective of the member, the consumer, and being a constructive critical friend of the regulator, being a statutory agency, I would imagine that would make it much more difficult to do that in a public advocacy way. So was that the thinking behind it not being following the UK model completely and being a non-statutory body?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that reflects, I guess, consumer advocacy in Australia generally. I think a strength of consumer advocacy in Australia is that, we look at things like the Consumers Health Forum, the Energy Consumers Australia, the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network. These are all independent bodies, independent of government. They're not backed up by statute, and it gives them a certain independence and strength to be able to speak out. And that's different to the model in the UK, where there are largely statutory bodies that speak for consumers.
And so how does, and excuse my ignorance, Angela's mate, I'm not going to share ignorance with others, I've got my own. Who then would make the appointments? Who sort of becomes, is there like a board above that, the SCC, and they decide then who the CEO is, and the CEO then appoints? So who decides who's on the board?
Well, I think that would be have to be determined. There are various mechanisms.
What happened with the other examples you talked about?
So for Choice, for example, they are an independent organisation that have their own members of choice. So that's one model that you could use, a membership model that would choose the board. So there might be interested, active people, superannuation consumers that want to be members that could elect the board. In other sectors, so for example, Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, ACAN, their members are other community organisations and not-for-profit organisations. I think they've got over 500 members or more that have some interest in telecommunications. It's not their primary function, but they have an interest. And so that membership plays a role in appointing the board. With Energy Consumers Australia, it is slightly different. That has, I think, one of the COAG Energy Council ministers is the member of the company, and so it's effectively COAG Energy Council that appoint the board members.
Okay. I think it'd be helpful for us through the CFA, that represents the broader umbrella of organisations, if you could give us some guidance on, because we do appreciate what you're saying and consistent with what the Commission's found in the past of a role here. Indeed, given what we're saying about regulators and what we need regulators to do going forward, probably it's very timely that this gets revisited now, but it'd be good for us to get a little bit more guidance, revisit around the funding, particularly given what returns are at the moment. If it's depends on what investment strategy you decide to have.
Yes.
But whether that's adequate now to staff about 25 people within the organisation, how the governance model might work, and who would make the appointments, given that we're in the world of any selection process at the moment seems to be highly politicised for everybody. So that would be very helpful for us. And it's funny when you talk about, I guess the other thing, you've talked about advocacy, assistance and education. So underpinning the education would be, underpinning the advocacy and education would have to be a lot of self-initiated research that the centre would do. And it was funny, we were talking about this just before. I rewind the clock 4 or 5 years, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and ASFA used to do a lot of research in the super space that was very member-friendly. Indeed, they were one of the first that came up with a very robust estimate of unintended multiple accounts, but that doesn't seem to be occurring anymore. So I think it's elevated the case of nobody else is really doing that work, apart from when we get tasked to do it by the government, or we decide we can do it anyway.
I would agree with that.
So that'd be great if we could just get a very short draft report submission would be really helpful. And on the funding, you're still comfortable with government industry co-funding models, so it's sort of got a joint ownership?
Well, I think that the proposal initially was a once-off amount, so the amount would be there as a corpus, if you like, and it wouldn't rely on external ongoing support. But there was a benefit in that as well, because it recognised that the government and the industry benefit from well-resourced and effective consumer advocacy.
Yep. No, especially in some of the areas that we've identified that we want the industry to lift its game around insurance and all the rest. So,
yeah, I think that's all the questions we have, unless there's anything else you wanted to raise.
Nothing else from me.
Okay,
thank you very much.
Okie dokie. Running a little bit ahead, which means that our next participants may not be here. Have we got the representatives from the ACTU? We might just take a little pause. Stretch our legs for 5 minutes, folks, and we'll come back, and we are running a little bit ahead of time. The first. It's very efficient.
That was such a good opening statement. We didn't have last year.
Yeah. still don't. Hey.
Joseph.
Hi, welcome. We've thrown a bit ahead, so as soon as I finish this up.
Yeah. Cool. What's your bathroom?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. So we're sitting here, aren't we? Or...
Yeah, just have a
Oh, yeah. With our name on it. Yeah. Okay.